Richard Holloway was a man who had everything money could buy. His mansion sat on a hill outside of Atlanta, with golden chandeliers, polished marble floors, and a staff of workers who moved quietly, making sure his life stayed flawless. People envied him, but those who knew him closely whispered that Richard had grown cold after losing his wife years ago. He trusted no one, not even people working under his roof. One morning, he leaned back in his leather chair, sipping his coffee, while his eyes studied the maid moving carefully around the room. Her name was Angela, a black single mother who had worked in his home for nearly 2 years. She never spoke much, kept her head down, and did her job with quiet dignity. Her little girl, Maya, would sometimes come with her after school, sitting silently in the corner with homework. Richard rarely paid attention, except to note how different the child was, always polite, always watchful. But recently, Richard's suspicion had grown. He had heard too many stories of staff taking advantage when employers weren't looking, stealing jewelry, cash, or things that couldn't be easily noticed. And though Angela had never given him reason to doubt her, Richard's mistrustful heart whispered otherwise. That's when an idea struck him. He would test them. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Richard stretched out on the grand sofa in his living room. The fire crackled low, and the smell of polish still lingered from Angela's cleaning. He pretended to be exhausted, letting his head sink into the cushions, his breathing slowing until it seemed like he had drifted off into sleep. Angela entered quietly with her daughter. She thought the billionaire was asleep, and her expression softened for the first time Richard had ever noticed. Maya tugged at her mother's hand and whispered something that made Angela smile. Richard's ears sharpened. He kept his eyes closed, waiting, testing, to see what the maid's little girl would do when she thought no one was watching. Maya looked around the room, her eyes wide at the glittering chandelier and the massive fireplace. To her, this mansion felt like a palace from the fairy tales her mother used to read. She tugged Angela's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, do you think he's really asleep?" Angela glanced at Richard. His breathing was slow, steady, and his face turned slightly toward the fire. To her, it looked like the billionaire was lost in deep rest. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "We must be quiet. Let him rest." But Maya didn't move away. Instead, she stepped closer to the sofa, her small footsteps barely making a sound against the thick carpet. She stood there, just looking at Richard's face. It wasn't the hardened face of a man with power and wealth anymore. It was the tired face of someone carrying invisible weight. "Why does he always look so sad, Mama?" Maya asked in a low voice. Angela froze. She hadn't expected her daughter to notice. Children saw things adults overlooked, and Maya had always been sensitive. Because, Angela whispered carefully, sometimes even rich people have hearts that hurt. Money can't fix everything. Richard, still pretending to sleep, felt a chill at those words. He had told no one how empty his nights were, how he would stare at his late wife's picture until his eyes burned. And now, this child, this maid's daughter, was reading his sadness like an open book. Maya bent down slowly, close enough that Richard could smell the faint scent of strawberries from her hair. She whispered, almost like a secret meant only for him, "It's okay, mister. You don't have to be sad forever." Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to open his eyes to respond, but he forced himself to remain still. What would she do next? Angela noticed her daughter, leaning so close, and quickly reached for her hand. "Maya," she whispered, a bit alarmed. "Come away, sweetheart. Don't disturb him." But Maya pulled back gently and smiled. "I wasn't disturbing him, Mama. I was just telling him something he needed to hear." Angela sighed, unaware of the way Richard's heart thudded behind his closed eyes. For the first time in years, the billionaire wasn't just suspicious. He was unsettled. Something was changing inside him, and he didn't know how to stop it. Angela guided Maya toward the corner of the room where her school books waited in a neat stack. "Do your homework, baby," she whispered, giving her a gentle pat. "We won't be here much longer." Maya sat down, but her eyes kept wandering back to the man on the sofa. She had never been this close to him before. Most days, Richard Holloway walked past her as if she didn't exist, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floors, his face stern and unreadable. But now, asleep, He looked almost human, fragile, even. Richard, on the other hand, kept his breathing steady, though his mind raced. He had staged this moment to see if Angela or her daughter would try to steal something. His watch lay on the side table, his wallet tucked just within reach. He had purposely left a few crisp $100 bills peeking out, bait for temptation. But instead of greed, what he found was compassion. The child hadn't reached for money or jewels. She had reached for his heart. From the corner, Maya's soft voice floated back to her mother. "Mama, do you think he's lonely?" Angela glanced at the sleeping figure, then back at her daughter. She lowered her voice. "That's not for us to say, sweetheart. We just do our job and stay respectful. Don't forget, this isn't our home." "But it feels so empty," Maya said. "Big, but empty, like it needs laughter." Angela pressed her lips together. Her daughter's innocence sometimes worried her. This was a billionaire's mansion, not a place for them to imagine filling with warmth. She turned her focus back to polishing the silver tray, trying to end the conversation. Meanwhile, Richard's chest tightened again. He had spent years surrounding himself with expensive silence. No children's laughter echoed in these halls. No warmth filled the spaces his wife once brought to life. To hear it said aloud by a little girl, it cut deeper than he expected. Maya, ignoring her mother's warning, whispered again, "I wish I could make him smile." Angela gave her daughter a sharp look. "Maya, enough." Richard fought the urge to open his eyes. Every word from that child pierced through his defenses. He had set a trap to expose dishonesty, but instead, it was exposing him. Angela finished polishing and moved quietly to gather the empty glasses from the table. She worked with practiced hands, careful not to wake the man she believed was asleep. Maya, however, couldn't help stealing glances at him. Her little face was full of thought, the kind that children usually save for dreams. After a few minutes, Maya tiptoed across the room again, clutching a piece of paper from her school notebook. She had been drawing while her mother cleaned. She paused near Richard, looking at him with soft eyes. Then, almost as if she couldn't resist, she set the paper gently on the side table beside his watch and wallet. Richard felt it, the faint rustle of paper against wood. His instinct screamed to open his eyes, to see what she had left. But he stayed still, every muscle tense. Angela noticed and quickly hurried forward. "Maya, what did I tell you? Leave him alone." She reached for the paper, but Maya shook her head. "It's for him, Mama. He needs it." Angela frowned, torn between scolding her daughter and avoiding any trouble. She glanced back at Richard, still motionless, then sighed and let the paper stay. "Fine," she whispered sharply. "But that's the last time. No more." Maya nodded, her eyes bright with quiet determination. Minutes passed. Angela finished tidying and gathered her daughter's things. She gently took Maya's hand and led her toward the door. The room fell into silence again as their footsteps faded down the hallway. Only when he was certain they were gone did Richard finally open his eyes. Slowly, he turned his head toward the side table. His gaze landed on the folded paper. For a long moment, he hesitated, almost afraid of what he would find. With steady fingers, he picked it up and unfolded it. Inside was a simple drawing, a stick figure man sitting alone beneath a big house. Next to him, a smaller stick figure girl held out a flower, a smile drawn on her face. Beneath it, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "It's okay to smile again." Richard's throat tightened. He hadn't cried in years, but the edges of his vision blurred. He pressed the paper against his chest, stunned by how a child's innocent sketch could pierce through walls of grief money had never touched. Richard sat alone in the quiet room, staring at the drawing in his hand. For years, people had tried to comfort him with fancy words, expensive gifts, or shallow sympathy. None of it had ever touched him. Yet here, from a little girl he barely knew, came a message so simple it shook the very walls of his heart. It's okay to smile again. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket, like it was worth more than all the gold in his house. For the first time in a long while, Richard didn't feel like the master of a mansion. He felt like a man who had been seen. The next morning, Angela returned for her shift. She looked tired, carrying herself with the quiet strength Richard had always noticed but never acknowledged. Maya was with her again, skipping lightly as children do, a small backpack bouncing on her shoulders. Richard decided not to reveal what he had done the night before. Instead, he watched them from his study window as they walked up the long driveway. Something inside him wanted to step out, to thank Maya for her gift, but pride and habit held him back. He wasn't ready to show vulnerability. Not yet. Later, when Angela was dusting the shelves in the library, Richard cleared his throat. "Angela," he said, his tone calm but sharp enough to make her straighten nervously. "Your daughter, she was here yesterday." Angela froze, the feather duster in her hand trembling slightly. "Yes, sir," she answered carefully. I hope she wasn't in the way." Richard studied her for a long moment. She left something behind. Angela's heart sank. She turned quickly, ready to apologize. "I'm so sorry, sir. Maya is a sweet girl, but sometimes she forgets boundaries. I'll make sure." Richard raised a hand, stopping her. "No," he said quietly. "Don't. It wasn't a problem." His eyes flickered, almost softening. "In fact, it surprised me." Angela blinked, unsure how to respond. She had expected anger, but instead she saw something unfamiliar in his expression, something close to gratitude. Maya, overhearing from the hallway, peeked her head in with a small grin. "Did you like my picture?" she asked innocently. Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. He wasn't used to such honesty. Finally, he gave the faintest nod. Maya's eyes lit up when Richard nodded. To her, that small gesture felt like a victory. She bounced into the library, clutching her backpack straps, and stood in front of him with innocent courage. "I drew it because you look sad," she said. "Did it make you feel better?" Angela rushed forward, her cheeks flushed. "Maya, that's enough. Don't trouble Mr. Holloway with—" But Richard lifted a hand gently, silencing her. He looked down at the little girl, his voice steady but softer than Angela had ever heard. "Yes," he admitted. "It did." The room fell quiet. Angela stared at him in shock, unsure she had heard correctly. For 2 years, she had worked under this roof, following orders, listening to his clipped tones, never once hearing him reveal anything human. Yet here he was, confessing to her daughter of all people. Maya beamed, her small smile like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Then I'll draw you another one," she announced proudly. "One every day, until you smile for real." Richard almost chuckled, the sound foreign in his throat. "That's very kind of you, Maya." Angela finally found her voice. "Sir, please forgive her. She doesn't mean any disrespect. She's just—" "Angela," Richard interrupted firmly, though his tone lacked its usual edge. "There's nothing to forgive." His gaze lingered on her for a moment, softer than before. "Your daughter sees things most adults don't." Angela lowered her eyes, caught between pride and fear. She knew kindness from an employer could turn at any moment, and she couldn't risk losing her job. But a small part of her was touched by his words. Later that evening, after they had left, Richard walked the long halls of his mansion. Everywhere he went, silence followed him, heavy and hollow. He paused by the grand dining table where 20 people could sit, yet it hadn't hosted a single guest in years. He thought about Maya's voice, big but empty, like it needs laughter. For the first time, he wondered if the child was right. Upstairs in his study, he pulled a folded drawing from his pocket again. His hand trembled as he placed it on the desk, next to a framed photograph of his late wife. He stared between the two, the memory of his past and the fragile hope of something new. His heart whispered truth he had ignored for too long. Maybe the mansion wasn't the only thing empty. The next few days carried a strange new rhythm inside Richard's mansion. Angela continued her work as usual, careful, precise, always keeping her head down. But Maya, true to her word, began leaving little drawings wherever she went. One showed a smiling sun over the mansion. Another had Richard standing beside a tree with flowers at his feet. Each one carried a message in her uneven handwriting. "Don't be lonely," or "Smiles are free." At first, Richard didn't know what to do with them. He wasn't a man who welcomed gestures of affection. Yet he couldn't bring himself to throw them away. Instead, he placed them quietly in his desk drawer, like hidden treasures. Angela noticed. She saw the way he handled Maya's drawings, the way his expression softened when he thought no one was looking. It unsettled her. Billionaires didn't simply change overnight. People like Richard lived behind walls higher than any servant could climb. And yet, something in him was shifting, and it terrified her as much as it gave her hope. One afternoon, as Angela vacuumed the hallway, Richard stepped out of his study. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Angela," he said. She straightened quickly, turning off the machine. "Yes, sir." His eyes flickered with something unspoken. "Your daughter, she reminds me of someone." Angela hesitated. "Who, sir?" "My wife," he answered quietly. The word alone seemed to weigh him down. He hadn't spoken of her in years. She had that same way of seeing through people. Angela's chest tightened. She had never expected to hear such vulnerability from him. Unsure how to respond, she lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry for your loss." Richard nodded faintly, his throat tight. "You don't need to be sorry. But your daughter, she has given me something I thought I'd buried with her." Angela's eyes lifted just slightly, meeting his. "And what is that?" Richard paused, his gaze distant. The possibility of joy. Before Angela could reply, Maya skipped down the hallway, holding yet another paper. "Look, Mr. Holloway," she said brightly, waving in the air. Richard bent down slowly, his knees stiff, and took the drawing from her small hands. This one showed 3 figures, Richard, Maya, and Angela, all smiling beneath the same roof. For the first time in years, Richard felt his lips curve upward. It wasn't forced. It wasn't polite. It was real. Richard stood there holding the drawing, his chest rising and falling as if a weight had shifted inside him. A genuine smile, something he had thought impossible, spread across his face. Maya clapped her hands with delight. "See? I told you I'd make you smile," she exclaimed. Angela's breath caught. She had never seen this side of him. The Richard she knew was always distant, guarded, impossible to read. Yet here he was, kneeling to her daughter's level, smiling like he had been waiting years for someone to remind him how. Richard gently placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "You did," he admitted. "You reminded me that life isn't just about surviving." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Angela looked away quickly, hiding the sting of tears in her eyes. She couldn't afford to blur the lines. This was still her employer. This was still a world far above hers. And yet, in this moment, all those barriers seemed to crumble under the innocence of a child. That evening, after they left, Richard lingered in the library, staring at the newest drawing. His mansion, usually filled with silence, now echoed with a memory of Maya's laughter. It haunted him in the best way. For years, he had lived in darkness, clinging to grief as if it were all he had left. But now, light had slipped through the cracks. Light carried by Maid's little girl who saw him not as a billionaire, but as a lonely man who needed to smile. The following morning, Richard made an unusual decision. When Angela arrived, he didn't retreat to his office as usual. Instead, he joined her in the kitchen while she prepared tea. She nearly dropped the spoon when she saw him standing there. "Sir, is everything all right?" she asked, startled. Richard nodded slowly. "I was wondering," he began, his voice softer than ever, "if you and Maya would stay for dinner tonight, as my guests." Angela's eyes widened. Guests? The word felt foreign on her tongue. "Sir, that isn't necessary. We're here to work, not—" "I insist," Richard interrupted gently. "This house has been empty for too long. It's time it hears laughter again." Angela stood frozen, tore between duty and the spark of hope in his eyes. Maya, overhearing from the hallway, squealed with joy. "Mama, can we? Please." For the first time in years, Richard felt anticipation for something other than business. He wasn't testing them anymore. He was inviting them in. That evening, the grand dining table, usually covered in dust and untouched silverware, was set for 3. The chandeliers glowed warmly, and for once, the mansion didn't feel like a museum. It felt alive. Angela arrived with Maya, both dressed simply but neatly. Angela looked uneasy, her hands tightening around her daughter's shoulders. She whispered, "Remember, Maya, this isn't playtime. We must behave." But when Richard appeared at the end of the hallway, dressed in a dark suit without his usual sternness, Maya ran toward him with the same fearless joy as always. "You look different," she said, grinning up at him. Richard chuckled, a sound even he barely recognized. "Do I?" He bent down slightly. "Maybe it's because I'm looking forward to dinner." Angela's chest tightened at his words. She had never imagined this man laughing, let alone inviting her to share a meal at his table. Still, she kept her composure as Richard guided them inside. Dinner began awkwardly at first. Angela kept her eyes on her plate, unsure how much she was allowed to say. Richard, sensing her discomfort, turned to Maya. "Tell me about school," he asked. And just like that, the silence broke. Maya launched into stories about her teacher, her favorite books, and how she wanted to be an artist. Richard listened intently, nodding and asking questions, his coldness melting into warmth. He hadn't realized how much he missed this. Simple conversation, the sound of laughter filling his home. At one point, Maya leaned over and whispered loudly, "Mama makes the best cornbread in the world, better than this fancy bread." Angela flushed with embarrassment. "Maya." But Richard laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the dining room. "Then one day, I must try your mother's cornbread," he said. The atmosphere shifted after that. Angela relaxed just a little, and Richard found himself stealing glances at her, at the quiet strength in her posture, the way she tried to hide her smile whenever Maya said something silly. By the time dessert was served, Richard realized something shocking. For the first time in years, he didn't dread the night ahead. The mansion didn't feel empty. It felt like home. As Angela gathered Maya's things to leave, Richard stood by the door. "Thank you," he said softly. Angela hesitated, confused. "For what, sir?" "For reminding me what life feels like." His eyes lingered on both mother and daughter. "This house hasn't been this alive in years." Angela didn't know what to say, but in her heart, something stirred, something she hadn't felt in a long time. That night, long after Angela and Maya had gone, Richard walked through the mansion with a strange lightness in his step. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt crushing. It felt expectant, like walls waiting to echo with life again. He paused at the dining table, still set for 3, and for the first time in years he whispered aloud, "Thank you." The following weeks became different from anything Richard had known in years. Maya's visits no longer felt like interruptions. They felt like blessings. She continued leaving her little drawings, one of him laughing, another of the mansion filled with flowers, and even one of him holding hands with Angela and Maya. Each picture peeled away another layer of grief he had clung to for too long. Angela, though cautious, began to notice a change. Richard spoke with her more often, asked about her life, and even helped Maya with her homework once, surprising them both. The hard, cold billionaire image was cracking, revealing someone softer, someone deeply human. One evening, as Angela finished tidying the library, Richard stood by the window, holding one of Maya's drawings. "Angela," he said quietly, "when I lost my wife, I thought the rest of my life would be nothing but shadows. I built walls so high that no one could reach me. But your daughter," she walked right in. Angela's throat tightened. "She's just a child, sir. She doesn't understand the world the way we do." "Maybe that's the point," Richard replied. "Maybe she sees what we've forgotten, that broken hearts can still heal." Angela met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't see a cold employer. She saw a man searching for light. The next day, as they were leaving, Maya ran back and slipped another folded paper into Richard's hand. "This is the last one," she said seriously. Richard unfolded it after they left. It showed him standing tall, a smile on his face, with the words in her crooked handwriting. "You're not alone anymore." Tears blurred his vision. For so long, he had tested people, expecting betrayal. But this child had tested him instead, and proved that even the loneliest heart could find its way back to life. Richard pressed the paper to his chest. For the first time in years, He knew tomorrow wouldn't feel empty. He wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He was a man learning to live again, thanks to Maid's little girl who had given him the greatest gift of all, hope.